Hey everyone, this week I thought I would do a little video about some of the books that I read in 2017 which I thought I would recommend to you. So I read a lot of young adult fiction in 2017 because last January I discovered BookTube. So I came across some people who were chatting about young adult fiction, and one in particular is Pierre Ford, who is an Australian booktuber, and there's a link to her channel at the side of my channel. So she kind of seemed to have similar interest to me. I like fantasy fiction. I read widely. I read all sorts of fiction, but I do like fantasy fiction. And she was recommending quite a few young adult trilogies that I hadn't actually heard of before, and talking about authors I hadn't heard of before. And I've made quite a few good discoveries by following her recommendations. So I thought I would share 3 trilogies with you that I read last year, which I thoroughly recommend. All quite different, but all fantasy young adult fiction. So I thought I'd start with my least favourite. They're all good, but I'll end with the one that I enjoyed the most. So the first trilogy is Laini Taylor's Daughter of Smoke and Bone. So Daughter of Smoke and Bone is the first book in the trilogy. The second is Days of Blood and Starlight. And then the third book, which is quite a chunker of a book, is Dreams of Gods and Monsters. So, Daughter of Smoke and Bone is basically about a girl called Karu, who's about 17. She's an art student studying in Prague. So far so normal. However, now and again she goes through these sort of secret doors into another world where her family live, or her guardians. The key guardian being a guy called Brimstone. I use the term guy loosely because he's not actually a guy. He's a chimera, which is a sort of creature which is assembled from different body parts of animals, or not assembled from different body parts of animals, but it's just basically a creature which it might have the head of a lion and the body of a snake and the legs of an antelope or something like that. So that's what Brimstone is, and that's her family. And for some reason Karu always has to collect teeth and deliver these teeth to Brimstone, and he does something with them. She doesn't know what, and obviously as a teenager she's starting to get a bit more curious about what does he do with these teeth. So again, I don't like to give spoilers, so I can't really tell you much about what happens in the trilogy, but essentially there's a few, not very many doors that she can use to access Brimstone in this other world, and the doors start to close. So she basically has to make a choice, is she going to keep living her sort of normal life in the human world, or is she going to try and find out what is making the doors close? Of course we know she's going to find out what is making the doors close, because that's the whole point. So I will mention that there are angels in this as well, and it's quite different. There's a lot of fantasy fiction which uses the same sort of, obviously it has similar themes to a lot of fantasy fiction books, and there are certain tropes which, of course there is some, sort of a love element in it, which is okay. It's done better than some young adult books. Sometimes I think they're a bit saccharine and a bit too over the top. It does get a little bit much in the second book, but I think it's the second book, but yeah, overall it's really good, and it's quite, again, sort of a more original story than some fantasy books that I've read. And just to give you an idea, if you didn't get my description of what a chimera is, I'll read you a little bit here from the book. So Brimstone, which is Karu's guardian, Brimstone was a monster. Brimstone's arms and massive torso were the only human parts of him, though the tough flesh that covered them was more hide than skin. His square pectorals were riven with ancient scar tissue, one nipple entirely obliterated by it, and his shoulders and back were etched in more scars, a network of puckered white cross-hatchings. Below the waist he became else thing. His haunches, covered in faded off-gold fur, rippled with leonine muscle. But instead of the padded paws of a lion, they tapered to wicked clawed feet that could have been either raptor or lizard, or perhaps, Karu fancied, dragon. And then there was his head. Roughly that of a ram, it wasn't furred but fleshed in the same tough brown hide as the rest of him. It gave way to scales around his flat, ovine nose and reptilian eyes, and giant yellowed ram horns spiralled on either side of his face. So that's what a chimera is, and it's really interesting. And what got me originally was obviously Pierre's recommendation. the cover it's described as Northern Lights and Pan's Labyrinth in one. Pan's Labyrinth is a really dark sort of fantasy film, which I really enjoyed, so I kind of picked it up on that extra quote on the front. I thought it sounded really good. So I do recommend the trilogy. I think it's sort of, there's a bit of repetition in the second book, which I do find with trilogies, where they go over a lot of stuff at the beginning of the book and even in the third book as well, you know, kind of recapping the story, and that does kind of frustrate me a little bit because, you know, I always imagine that, you know, who reads a trilogy, like not very many people are going to just read the last book of a trilogy unless they do it accidentally. Technically, if you start a trilogy and you're reading the second book, the author should assume that you've read the first book, and I don't think you need quite so much catching up. So there's quite a bit of that, which kind of frustrated me a little bit. But once you get back into the stories, it's really good. So yeah, I definitely recommend this trilogy. The next one is A Darker Shade of Magic trilogy by Victoria Schwab, or V.E. Schwab as she also is known. This is a strange one actually, because it is one that I really enjoyed, but I think it's slightly overhyped. I've heard a lot of people go a bit on the booktube community go really mad for it, and I really did enjoy it, but I was expecting a bit more from it because of that. So the first book, I enjoyed it, but I wasn't completely blown away by it. Now, I did buy the trilogy all together, so I bought all the 3 books together, so because I had them I thought, well, I liked it enough that I want to keep reading, and I've got the books, so I'll keep reading them. But I wasn't completely enthralled by it. I did really like it, but it didn't blow me away the way I thought it would. The second book, you know, trilogies are a bit of a thing, especially in young adult fiction at the minute, where there's so many trilogies floating about. I don't think they're always necessary to have 3 books. Sometimes I think a duology would be better, just to have 2 books, or even just to have 1 book. So this is a trilogy where I think possibly 2 books would have been sufficient. But the second book is A Gathering of Shadows. Love the covers, by the way. The covers are really, really good. So the second book, I kind of thought, you know, again, I enjoyed it, but I thought there was a lot of, it was more of like I don't want to say a filler story, but I just thought you could have condensed it. You could have condensed these 2 into 1 book. My personal opinion, others may disagree, that's fine. Again, I did really enjoy it, but I just kind of thought I wanted a bit more to happen in it. However, the third book, which again is really the thickest of the 3, A Conjuring of Light, I really enjoyed this book, and the third book would be my favourite of the trilogy, and I think there's a lot more that happens in it. Obviously the story concludes and there's just all the characters come together, and yeah, to me this is the best instalment of the trilogy. Obviously then you would need to read the first 2 to get to this point, but I think you can fly through the first one pretty quickly because it's quite short, and the second one is a little bit longer, but again, you know, it's a good story, so you'll read it quite quickly. So what is it about? A guy called Kel. I have to remind myself of the names because it's quite a while since I read these books. So Kel is one of the last travellers, which means he's a magician who can cross parallel worlds. So essentially, in the world of A Darker Shade of Magic, there are 4 Londons. There's Grey London, which is basically the closest thing to our world. So Grey London is basically there's no magic left, hence grey. It's a bit drab, it's just, you know, there's no spark there. Kel lives in Red London, where magic is sort of revered and still very much alive and kicking. And he sort of travels between the realms, taking letters from the ruler of the Red Kingdom to the King in Grey London. So he's kind of like a messenger between the rulers. However, he also does a bit of smuggling as well, which he's not supposed to do. So that's Grey London, Red London. Then you've got White London, which is losing its magic. It's not as full of magic as it once was. So they're kind of struggling to cope with that. And essentially it's like as if White London's sort of dying because the magic is sort of slowly draining from it. And then you've got Black London, which is part of the problem because Black London is completely shut off and it's completely black and dead, and the magic it's turned really dark and bad, and it's just somewhere that you really don't want to go. So Kel meets a girl called Delilah Bard, and and her story is very interesting in this. A good strong female character if you like that sort of thing, which I hope that you do. And it's sort of about how she ultimately, I suppose, if I give spoilers away, obviously discovers these Londons through Kel and the adventures that they go on together. There's also other characters which are really interesting and really fun as well in Red London, because we found out that Kel actually, as well as being the messenger for the royal family in Red London, he's also been sort of adopted by them, because he doesn't know his parents, where he came from. And he has his brother, the prince, is quite funny as well, and it's really, it's a really good story. So again, don't want to give spoilers, but it's definitely a series I would recommend, and I'd say the final book in the trilogy is my favourite of this. Okay, the final, well, not the final because I've got an extra one to tell you about, but my favourite trilogy that I read in 2017 is, again, one that's one that I didn't actually think I would like so much, but because I had read other books that, as I say, Pierre Ford had recommended and really enjoyed them, and she went on with this series so much, I thought, right, I'm going to give it a go because it sounds good, but it's set in space. Now, I do read widely and I have read books set in space before, but I'm not really a sci-fi fan. I don't really like reading about things which take place on other planets. I'm not really a space opera sort of person. However, I'm always willing to give things a go, and I was very pleasantly surprised that I actually really did like this trilogy, and as I say, it's probably the favourite of all the young adult books that I read last year. So it is the Red Rising trilogy by the American author Pierce Brown. And we've got Red Rising is the first book, Golden Sun is the second, and then Morning Star, which is the third book. And although this is a complete trilogy, he's still writing in the Red Rising world. So the latest book is Iron Gold, which I haven't got yet, but I am going to buy. And it's set in the Red Rising world, but it's sort of looking at different characters, and it's like a sort of continuation of the world, but not of the characters necessarily that are in these books. So, get the first book. So Red Rising is basically set across the universe. So we have moved on, and people have populated other planets, and basically humanity is ruled. There's a colour coordination system here. So humanity is ruled by a group of people called the Golds, who are sort of Adonis-like people who are really strong, golden-haired. They're the most powerful people, and they rule all the other colours. And reds are at the very, very bottom. So our protagonist in this is a guy called Darrow, and he's a red, and he lives on Mars, and he's a driller. He kind of works underground on Mars, and basically the Reds are trying to make Mars inhabitable for the rest of humanity. What they don't know is that Mars is already inhabitable, but they're being kept below ground, sort of as slaves basically, and they're labouring away, risking their lives. They don't have a very good life expectancy, and they don't get fed very well. Conditions aren't great, as slave conditions often aren't, and it's just not a great life. So Darrow, however, through various means, discovers that it's all a bit of a sham, and Red Rising is basically, you know, the uprising of the Reds. So he joins a group who are trying to revolt against the Golds, and to do this he has to infiltrate the Golds, and obviously he can't do that as a weedy little red, so he has to it's a bit of a Frankenstein type scenario goes on, where he gets well, this is a bit of a spoiler, where he gets sort of turned into a gold by various means, operations and things like that. So now, I haven't read the Hunger Games trilogy. I've seen the films, obviously, which I believe are very, very close to the books, and there are Hunger Game elements to the Red Rising, because whenever Darrow becomes part of the Gold community, obviously he starts off in the book as a teenager. I think by the end of the trilogy he's in his 20s, but when the book begins, he is a teenager, and he has to join like a sort of training academy. They kind of have to prove themselves to get to the next level, or, you know, to progress in society basically. And it gets a bit gruesome, which I'm not always a big fan of gruesome things in books. I don't like the gore, but it is a little bit gory throughout the series, and there's a bit of Hunger Games type survival of the fittest going on. But it's really, really compelling, and it's really, again, a very unique story. I think it's very interesting, and it just gets better with every book. You know, I was saying before that some trilogies should be a duology or should just be one book. Well, Red Rising is definitely a book, a series that is very, very much deserving of all three books. The story just gets better with every book, and it's very intricate. I mean, there's so much. There's quite a large cast of characters. There's some really good, quirky characters. Darrow's best friend turns out to be a little gold called Severo. He's quite a funny little character, and it's just, I would say definitely if you like action and adventure and just love a good story, then definitely give Red Rising a go. And if you don't like science fiction, well, don't let that put you off, because if it had put me off, then I would have missed out on a very good series. So yes, those are the books I want to recommend. Now, there's another trilogy which I forgot I actually read in 2016. I thought it was last year, but I thought I would just mention it briefly here. This is adult. It's definitely, I think, classed more as adult fiction rather than young adult fiction. There's definitely a lot of adult themes in it, in case you're thinking of giving it to like a 13-year-old. I'm not quite sure it's appropriate. But it's The Magician's Trilogy by Lev Grossman. Now, I actually discovered this trilogy because Channel 5 Star was showing the series on TV, and they're both very good, but in very different ways, because like most TV series, they diverge from the book, and it gets quite confusing, because I decided to read the trilogy as I was watching the series, and they do differ quite a lot in some of the specifics. However, both are really good, so I would recommend that you watch the series and also read the books. So we've got, the first one is The Magicians, the second is The Magician King, and the third is The Magician's Land. So these are basically, I think, if you like Harry Potter and you like Narnia, this is like a grown-up version of both of those meshed together. The story of Quentin Coldwater, who is, again, a sort of ordinary student until one day he's not, and he's a bit of a bookish, nerdy sort of person. Nothing wrong with that. And he loves this book series about a place called Fillory, which is just, you know, like a make-believe place like Narnia, or so he thinks. Because it turns out that he finds himself one day on the way, I think he's on the way to some, like a university interview or assessment or something, and he finds himself not quite where he expected to be, so he finds himself in this is where the Hogwarts comparison comes into, but he finds himself like a sort of magician's university instead. Doesn't quite know how he got there, but he sits the exam and he gets accepted into this school or university or whatever. So it's a I should probably read you the blurb, because say it's a couple of years since I read this. So when Quentin is unexpectedly admitted to an elite secret college of magic, it looks like his wildest dreams may have come true. Because obviously he loves Fillory, which is about a magical kingdom. He loves the idea of magic. He just doesn't think it exists. But his newfound powers lead him down a rabbit hole of hedonism and disillusionment, and ultimately to the dark secret behind the story of Fillory. The land of his childhood fantasies turns out to be much darker and more dangerous than he could ever have imagined. So there's so much that goes on in it. To be honest, I think I would like to reread this trilogy, because, as I say, the TV series kind of screwed my head up a little bit, because there's so much goes on in that, and there's so much goes on in the books, and it all differs quite a lot. But I really enjoyed this trilogy. Again, I keep saying things are really original, but these trilogies, they're all so different, and this one, although it's been likened, you know, to Narnia and Harry Potter, it's obviously very different from both of those. You know, it's got the same concept where there's different magical lands and you've got your College of Magic, but the way that it's presented is all very different. Again, as I say, it's more of an adult storyline, quite dark as well, and just, I really, really recommend this. So it's probably one, if I ever get around to doing proper reviews of books, it's probably a trilogy that I should reread and then give a good book review of it, spoilers included, because it's I really enjoyed it. So I think this has probably turned into quite a long video again, apologies for that. But if you're, looking for book recommendations, and, I wouldn't be put off by young adult fiction, because, there's loads of really good children's books that I read, and, a good story is a good story. And I think sometimes people don't read YA fiction because they think, oh, it's just for teenagers. And yes, the protagonists are often teenagers, but example, in Red Rising, the main character is nearly 30 by the time the book's finished. You've got adult books which are written about 20-year-olds. So I wouldn't let that put you off. Some of the young adult fiction out there is actually quite dark and gritty. The standard of writing is really, really good, and it's worth, if you're going to give some a go. If you like fantasy, then definitely those 3 trilogies I recommended. Go read those. Okay, so thanks for watching, and if you have any book recommendations for me, leave them in the comments below. That would be great. Always love to hear about new books, and I will chat to you soon. Thanks, goodbye.